Hey, welcome to CNC Router Project Start to Finish. In this episode, we'll be looking at the steps involved in creating this set of yin and yang Tealight candle holders. These were cut from radiata pine. I'm using this wood because it's relatively inexpensive. It's typically free from knots and often available with some interesting grain pattern. I'm going to be cutting these from a piece of 1x8, partly because I have some scrap 1x8 lying around, but also because a 1x8 is wide enough that it allows the candle holders to be positioned such that the grain is running in this direction, which somehow seems much more natural to me than if it were clocked, say, 90 degrees to that, or some interval in between. Also, as you can see from this piece of scrap, using a 1x8 is fairly efficient. There's not a whole lot of waste left. All right, time to get started drawing and toolpathing some vectors. So one way to think of the yin and yang symbol is in terms of it being an arrangement of 5 different circles. And that's the approach I'm going to take in drawing this design. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a workspace that measures 6 inches by 6 inches. Next, I'm going to draw a circle that has a diameter of 6 inches. And then I'm going to center that up within the workspace. Now I'm going to draw 2 circles with a diameter half that of the larger circle. So 2 3-inch circles in this case. I'm going to center those up with respect to the vertical midline. And then I'm going to align the top of one of those circles with the top of the larger circle and the bottom of the other circle with the bottom of the larger circle. The final 2 circles in this drawing represent the area that will hold the actual Tealight candles, so the size of these circles depends upon the size of the candles. A 1.5-inch diameter is fairly common, so I'm going to work based upon that assumption. I'm going to allow a little bit of wiggle room, however, and make the circles 1.55 inches. Then I'm going to center these circles up within the 3-inch circles. So those are all of the elements of the symbol now. All that remains at this point is to trim a few select vectors. To isolate the piece that's going to be routed, I'm going to make 2 more edits. There's one final modification I'd like to make to this design. You can see that the tail portion comes to a really fine point. This probably isn't going to cut well. It's probably going to break off either during the routing process or the sanding process. So I'm going to make this tail piece end where the material is a little bit wider and then round it off. So I'm going to go into node editing mode and insert 2 points roughly opposite one another. The material width in this area is somewhere between 1/8 and 3/16. Then I'm going to cut the vector at those points and delete the old tail piece. Finally, the open vector can be closed either by drawing an arc or with this program by choosing the close vectors with a smooth curve command. So a number of things have changed on this screen since the conclusion of the drawing segment. The workspace has gotten a good deal larger. It now measures 24 inches by 18 inches. And that's so it accurately represents the actual space available on my router table. There's also a rectangle that measures 24 inches by 7.25 inches, and that represents the 1x8 board from which the candle holders will be cut. Of course, there are the candle holders themselves, and then there are 4 pairs of concentric circles. The larger circle represents the actual size of the head of the screw that will be used to hold the 1x8 down to the spoil board. The smaller circle represents the pilot hole. To create the pilot holes, I'm going to set up a drilling toolpath. I'm going to use a 1/16 inch end mill, cutting to a depth of 1/4 inch. So this drilling toolpath is probably not necessary for this project. it wouldn't be too difficult to approximate the location of the hold-down screws. But I always feel better using this approach, because now I'm completely assured that the bit is not going to crash into the hold-down screws, either damaging the bit or the project itself. To make the rounded top edge of the candle holders, I'm going to run a profiling toolpath using a 1/4-inch radius point-cutting roundover bit. The depth of the cut is set to 1/4 inch, and the machining is set to take place on the vector. Sometimes it makes more sense to machine outside the vector while using a negative offset, but for this project, on the vector is probably fine. For the holes in the candles, I'm going to use a pocketing toolpath set to a depth of 1/2 inch using a 1/4 inch bit. As far as the cutting strategy goes, I'm not sure it makes much difference here. If you're concerned with sanding and finishing a pocketed area, it might make more sense to raster with the grain so that the tool marks aren't as obvious and are easier to remove with sanding. This pocket is going to have a candle inside of it the majority of the time, so it's probably not critical. Finally, I'm going to cut the pieces out by running a profile toolpath with a 1/4 inch bit. The depth is set to just over 3/4 of an inch, and I'm going to zero to the bed as opposed to the top of the material to compensate for any variation in the thickness of the wood. Machine vectors should be set to outside, and a few tabs are required to hold the candle holders in place as they're being cut out. Now I'm going to run a quick preview of the toolpaths just to make sure everything turns out the way it's expected. And that looks good. So it's time to fire up the router. So the edges turned out a little bit rougher than I would have liked. I think part of the problem was having not used the negative offset with the roundover bit, but there were also some chatter marks in the wood. Now the 1x8 board had a bit of a cup and a twist to it, so that may have been part of the issue. But it's possible I need to revisit my feeds and speeds as well. It's really not that horrible though, and it's certainly nothing that a little bit of sanding can't take care of. If it's possible, I like to apply stain or other finishes to all of a project's surfaces, either at once or in fairly rapid succession. To help facilitate that, I've made a primitive handle out of a piece of scrap wood with a 2-inch drywall screw driven through it. And I'm going to thread the handle into a small hole that I've made in the bottom of the candle holder. Now I'm able to control the piece and still have access to all of the surfaces for finishing. When the finishing is complete, I can simply turn the unit over and balance it on the handle while it's drying. One obvious drawback to this approach is you now have a hole in the bottom of your candle holder, but if that's not objectionable, this might be a possible method. Since the candle holders are made of pine, which is somewhat notorious for taking stain poorly, I'm going to apply some pre-stain wood conditioner first. There's some debate over whether this type of product is actually effective, but I think it has made some difference in my projects. I apply 2 liberal coats about 10 minutes apart. As far as the stain is concerned, I've been using the Varathane or Varathane brand, specifically Golden Pecan for the lighter color candle holder, and in this example, Kona for the darker. A single coat usually seems to be enough to achieve the desired color. Although it's advertised as being top coat ready within an hour, I'm rarely in that much of a hurry, so I usually just end up waiting until the next day. Finally, I wipe on 2 coats of either satin or gloss polyurethane. All that's left at this point is to pop in a few candles and light them up.